Have you ever noticed how one question can completely change the direction of your life? Think about it. Every breakthrough begins not with an answer, but with a question. The young man in our story understood this truth. At first, he thought fluency meant memorizing thousands of words or mastering perfect grammar rules. But then he paused and asked himself, what am I really missing? That single question opened a new door in his mind. It wasn't about how much he knew, but how deeply he was willing to explore. Questions have power because they pull us forward. When he asked himself, how do fluent people think in English? He began to listen differently. When he wondered, why am I afraid of speaking? He faced his fear instead of hiding from it. Every time he asked, he discovered something new about himself. The act of questioning became his teacher, sharper and more honest than any textbook. And isn't that the secret of growth in anything we do? Children learn because they are curious. Travelers discover because they ask strangers for directions. Inventors create because they dare to ask, what if? In the same way, a learner grows fluent by daring to ask the right questions. Without them, he would remain stuck in the same routine, repeating the same mistakes. The difference is clear. Answers close the conversation, but questions keep it alive. Answers give you comfort, but questions give you direction. And for anyone who dreams of speaking English fluently, it all begins with the courage to ask, not just others, but yourself. What do I need to change today? How can I practice differently? What habit will bring me closer to fluency? The young man carried these questions like a lantern in the dark. They lit the path before him, step by step. And as he walked, the answers began to come, not all at once, but in the small daily actions that shaped his journey. Small habits often look too simple to matter, yet they are the seeds of greatness. The young man discovered this when he stopped chasing quick results and started focusing on the smallest actions he could repeat every single day. At first, he wanted to do everything: study long hours, memorize thick lists of words, finish grammar books in a week. But that approach only left him exhausted. One evening, as he sat frustrated with his heavy books, he asked himself, what if I just did one small thing today and did it again tomorrow? So he began with a simple habit: listening to 5 minutes of English audio daily. 5 minutes seemed almost meaningless, but he stayed with it. Over time, his ears became sharper, and he noticed words he had never paid attention to before. That tiny habit grew, quietly but steadily, until one day he could understand whole conversations without pausing. Then he added another small habit: learning 3 new words a day, just 3. It felt too little at first, but in a month he had nearly 100 new words, and in a year, over 1,000. The beauty of small habits is that they multiply. They don't demand perfection. They demand consistency. Like drops of water filling a jar, the daily effort began to overflow into his confidence. He realized what James Clear wrote in Atomic Habits: success is not the result of one huge change, but of tiny improvements repeated over time. The young man stopped worrying about how far he had to go and instead focused on the step right in front of him. And each small step carried him closer to fluency. It was then he understood: fluency is not built in hours, it is built in habits. The difference between those who give up and those who succeed is not talent, but the quiet discipline of repeating the small things, even when they seem invisible. Consistency became the quiet force that pushed the young man further than he ever imagined. In the beginning, he thought speed was everything. He compared himself to others, watched people speak effortlessly, and grew impatient. If I can just study harder and faster, maybe I'll catch up, he told himself. But the truth revealed itself slowly. Speed without consistency is like running fast in the wrong direction. You only end up further from your goal. One evening, he remembered a story from a book he once read about the tortoise and the hare. The hare had speed but lacked focus, while the tortoise, slow and steady, never stopped moving forward. The young man saw himself in that story. Fluency wasn't a race to be won in a week. It was a journey that rewarded those who showed up daily. So he made a new commitment: No matter how little time he had, he would practice something in English every single day. Even 10 minutes was better than nothing. There were days he felt tired, days he felt discouraged, but he showed up anyway. And that discipline began to change him. His progress was not dramatic at first, but it was steady. Slowly, his sentences grew smoother, his vocabulary richer, his confidence stronger. He learned that fluency doesn't come to those who rush, it comes to those who stay. Consistency builds trust with yourself. Every time he practiced, he was telling himself, I will not give up on this dream. And that message became more powerful than any quick result. The young man realized that speed fades, but consistency compounds. A little practice done daily will always beat intense effort done once in a while. This was his turning point. He no longer chased fast results. Instead, he trusted the process, step by step, day by day. Listening became his secret doorway into fluency. At first, he thought speaking was the most important skill, so he rushed to talk whenever he could. But soon, he realized that the ability to speak well begins with the ability to listen deeply. Words must first enter the ear before they can flow from the tongue. So he trained himself to listen differently. Instead of just hearing sounds, he paid attention to rhythm, pauses, and the music of sentences. When he listened to a podcast, he didn't simply focus on meaning. He studied how the speaker stressed certain words, how the tone rose and fell, how phrases connected smoothly. These small details became lessons that no grammar book could teach. He remembered how children learn their first language. They don't begin with speaking. They begin with listening. For months and years, they absorb every sound, every expression, until finally words come out naturally. The young man decided to imitate that same process. He filled his world with English voices, stories, songs, interviews, even conversations around him. Slowly, without forcing it, the sounds began to live inside his mind. There were moments when he felt frustrated because he couldn't understand everything, but instead of giving up, he practiced patient listening. Over time, the fog began to clear. Words that once sounded strange became familiar friends. Sentences that once rushed past him began to slow down, revealing their meaning. He discovered that deep listening is not passive, it is active. It requires focus, patience, and humility. And as he listened more, something remarkable happened. When he opened his mouth to speak, the same rhythm and tone he had absorbed began to flow out naturally. Listening had shaped his voice without him even realizing it. It was then he understood fluency doesn't just come from speaking more, but from listening better. The ear prepares the tongue, and the more you train your ears, the freer your words will become. Speaking without fear was the hardest lesson for him, yet it was also the most liberating. For a long time, fear kept his words locked inside. He worried about grammar, about mispronunciation, about people laughing at his mistakes. Each time he wanted to speak, a voice in his mind whispered, "Wait until you're perfect." But perfection never came, and silence became his prison. One day, while listening to a podcast, he heard a simple truth. Fluency is not the absence of mistakes. It is the courage to speak in spite of them. That line struck him deeply. He realized he had been waiting for a moment that would never arrive. The only way to become fluent was to open his mouth, even if the words stumbled out. So he began small. He practiced speaking to himself in front of the mirror. He narrated his daily tasks in English. I am making tea. I am writing a note. It felt strange at first, but slowly the fear lessened. Then he spoke to friends who were also learning. They laughed, yes, but not at him, at the joy of sharing the same journey. His turning point came when he spoke with a tourist in his city. His voice shook, his grammar slipped, but he kept going. And to his surprise, the tourist understood him. That moment lit a fire inside him. He saw that communication mattered more than perfection. The fear that had held him back began to lose its power. From then on, he treated every mistake as proof of progress. If he mispronounced a word, it meant he was trying. If he used the wrong tense, it meant he was learning. Bit by bit, his confidence grew, and with it, his fluency. He discovered that speaking without fear is not about ignoring mistakes. It's about embracing them as stepping stones. The brave tongue becomes the fluent tongue, and silence helps no one. Reading became his window to worlds he had never seen. At first, he thought reading was only about collecting new vocabulary, but soon he discovered it was much more. Each book, each story, each article opened doors not just to language, but to imagination, to culture, to thought itself. He started small, children's books, short stories, simple articles online. They felt easy, almost too easy, but they gave him confidence. Then he moved to novels, biographies, and even books on self-growth. One day he picked up The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho, and as he turned the pages, he realized that reading in English was no longer just a study task. It was an adventure. He wasn't only learning words, he was walking through deserts, meeting travelers, chasing dreams. The beauty of reading, he discovered, is that it feeds both the mind and the language. When he read, he wasn't just memorizing words in isolation. He was seeing them alive in sentences, breathing with meaning and emotion. He noticed how writers painted feelings with simple words, how they built images that stayed in the heart. Those patterns began to echo in his own speech and writing. Sometimes he read aloud, letting the rhythm of the sentences shape his tongue. Other times, he wrote down striking phrases, not to copy them, but to absorb their flow. Slowly, his vocabulary grew richer, his understanding deeper. Reading gave him the confidence to express thoughts he once felt were too big for his English. And beyond language, reading gave him perspective. It taught him how different people think, how different cultures express themselves. He saw that learning English was not just about speaking. It was about connecting to the vast human experience captured in words. He realized that every page he turned brought him closer to fluency. The more he read, the more he thought in English. And the more he thought in English, the more naturally the words came when he spoke. Writing became the mirror of his mind. At first, he underestimated it, thinking that speaking and listening were enough. But soon he realized that writing was not just practice. It was reflection. When he wrote, his thoughts slowed down, and in that space, he could see his mistakes, his strengths, and his progress with clarity. He began with the simplest habit, keeping a journal in English. Each night, he wrote a few lines about his day. Sometimes it was ordinary. I went to the market, I met my friend. Other times it was deeper, his dreams, his worries, his goals. The words were not perfect, but they were his. And with every page, he grew more comfortable expressing himself. At first, he hesitated, worried about spelling, grammar, or whether his sentences sounded strange. But then he reminded himself that writing was not about perfection. It was about practice. Slowly, the fear of mistakes faded, replaced by curiosity. He started experimenting with new words he had read in books, phrases he had heard in podcasts, and expressions he had picked up from conversations. One day, he compared his first journal entry to one he had written months later. The difference surprised him. His sentences were longer, his vocabulary more varied, his thoughts clearer. That moment taught him an important truth. Progress often hides in silence, but writing reveals it. Beyond skill, writing gave him freedom. He could explore his ideas without interruption, build his confidence without judgment, and rehearse his voice before sharing it with the world. Each written page was a rehearsal for fluent speech, each sentence a step closer to mastery. He discovered that writing regularly is not about filling pages, it's about shaping the mind. The more he wrote, the more he thought in English, and the more natural his words became when spoken aloud. Writing was not just practice, it was transformation. His environment became the silent teacher he had overlooked. For a long time, he believed English learning only happened in study sessions, books open, lessons planned, notebooks filled. But then he noticed something. The moments when he improved most were not always during study time, but in the small, unnoticed details of his surroundings. So he began reshaping his world. He changed his phone and computer into English, so every tap, every notification reminded him of the language he wanted to master. He placed sticky notes on everyday objects: mirror, door, cup, until his room itself became a vocabulary lesson. Even his playlists, once filled with local songs, now carried English lyrics that echoed through his day. At first, these changes felt small, almost playful, but slowly they created immersion. English was no longer something outside his life. It was woven into his daily routine. He read the news in English, watched movies with subtitles, and even followed social media accounts that posted in English. The language stopped being a subject and started becoming his environment. He realized how powerful surroundings can be. Just as a plant grows differently depending on the soil it's placed in, a learner grows faster when the environment nourishes their goal. Being surrounded by English shaped his thinking. Sometimes, without planning it, he caught himself forming thoughts in English, even when no one was around. That was when he knew the environment was working. It wasn't about perfection. It was about constant exposure. Even when he wasn't studying, his surroundings were teaching him. The walls of his room, the screen of his phone, the voices in his headphones, all whispered English into his daily life. He understood then. You don't just learn English, you live in it. And the more you design your environment to support your dream, the more natural fluency becomes. Discipline and patience became the foundation that held everything together. The young man had built habits, practiced listening, spoken with courage, read widely, and written regularly. His environment now pushed him forward every day. But without discipline, these habits would crumble. And without patience, he would give up before seeing the results. There were days when progress felt invisible. He would practice, yet still stumble on simple sentences. He would read, yet forget the words the next morning. Frustration whispered in his ear, "Maybe you are not meant for fluency." But discipline kept him steady. Even when he didn't feel motivated, he showed up. Even when the results seemed small, he kept practicing. He remembered a line from Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. "The obstacle is the way." Every struggle was not a barrier, but a lesson. Patience taught him that growth often happens in silence, beneath the surface, like roots spreading unseen before a tree bursts upward. Months later, he looked back and realized how far he had come. Sentences that once frightened him now flowed naturally. Words that once felt foreign now lived comfortably on his tongue. He saw clearly that fluency is not a gift given overnight. It is the reward of discipline and the patience to keep going, even when progress hides. Discipline taught him to practice daily. Patience taught him to trust time. Together, they became his strongest allies. He finally understood that mastery is not about talent, not about shortcuts, but about showing up again and again with faith that the small steps will one day carry you far. And so, his story became a reminder. Fluency is not built in a single moment. It is built in the quiet consistency of days, in the courage to keep going, and in the belief that every effort, no matter how small, is shaping the future you dream of.